Watch a dog for long enough and you'll swear it understands you. It reads your tone, your posture, the second you reach for its leash. Now go back 10,000 years. Strip away veterinary science, biology, zoology, every modern framework we use to explain animal behavior. What's left? Just a human, standing across from a wolf, or a horse, or a raven, trying to figure out what's going on inside a mind that clearly isn't empty, but clearly isn't human either. So did ancient people actually understand animals, or did they just build convincing stories around them? The answer is more surprising than you'd expect, because in some ways, they understood animals better than we give them credit for, and in other ways, they got it spectacularly wrong. Let's start with what ancient humans got right, because it's more than most people assume. Long before written language existed, hunter-gatherer survival depended on an intimate, functional understanding of animal behavior. Tracking a wounded animal for miles required reading footprints, broken twigs, scattered droppings, and translating all of it into a coherent story. How fast the animal was moving, how badly it was injured, which direction it would likely go to find water or shelter. This wasn't guesswork. It was applied behavioral science, refined over countless generations, passed down as survival knowledge rather than formal theory. Modern anthropologists studying present-day hunter-gatherer societies, groups like the Sand People of the Kalahari, have documented tracking skills so precise that trackers can identify individual animals by their prints, estimate age, sex, and physical condition, and predict behavior with an accuracy that rivals trained wildlife biologists using GPS collars. This tells us something important. Ancient humans weren't operating on superstition alone when it came to practical animal knowledge. Their survival depended on getting it right, so a huge amount of accurate observational science existed long before anyone called it science. Domestication is the clearest proof of this. Turning a wolf into a dog, a wild aurochs into cattle, a wild boar into a pig, none of that happens by accident. It requires understanding an animal's social structure, its breeding patterns, which individuals are calmer or more cooperative, and how to selectively encourage those traits over generations. Genetic evidence suggests dogs were domesticated from wolves at least 15,000 years ago, possibly much earlier, which means ancient humans were running a functional breeding program, tracking heritable behavior across generations, long before anyone understood genetics in any formal sense. That's not primitive thinking. That's applied science without the vocabulary to describe itself as science. But alongside this precise practical knowledge, ancient cultures built enormous symbolic and mythological frameworks around animals. And this is where things get more complicated. Because in many cases, ancient humans weren't just trying to predict animal behavior. They were trying to explain animal behavior by connecting it to the same forces that governed human life: gods, souls, morality, fate, and this is where accurate observation started blending with something else entirely. Ancient Egypt is a striking example of this blend. Egyptians were remarkably close observers of the natural world. Their art shows detailed, accurate depictions of birds, cattle, and crocodiles that reflect real first-hand study. But they also elevated specific animals to divine status. The ibis was connected to Thoth, the god of wisdom, partly because of its methodical, deliberate feeding movements, which Egyptians interpreted as a kind of intelligence worth honoring. Cats were closely associated with the goddess Bastet, and harming one, even accidentally, could carry serious social and religious consequences. This wasn't a total misunderstanding of animal behavior. Egyptians clearly noticed real differences between species, calm and predictable versus wild and dangerous, and built an entire theological structure to explain why those differences existed. They just explained it through divinity rather than biology. Ancient Greek thought pushed further toward a more analytical approach, though it still carried real limitations. Aristotle, often considered the first true biologist, spent enormous effort classifying animals based on direct observation and dissection. He got a huge amount right, distinguishing animals with blood from those without, correctly noting that dolphins and whales, unlike fish, breathe air and give birth to live young. But Aristotle also proposed a rigid hierarchy called the Scala Naturae, the ladder of nature, ranking all living things by a perceived level of soul and complexity, with humans firmly at the top. This framework assumed animals possessed a lesser kind of soul, capable of sensation but not reason, which meant many ancient Greek thinkers dismissed the possibility that animals had anything resembling genuine thought or emotion. So even careful observation got filtered through an assumption that fundamentally limited what ancient thinkers were willing to consider possible. Indigenous cultures across North America and Australia often approached animal understanding from a completely different angle. one that in some ways aligns surprisingly well with modern ecological thinking. Many indigenous belief systems didn't rank humans above animals in a strict hierarchy at all. Instead, animals were frequently understood as relatives, teachers, or spiritual equals, deserving of respect not because they served human purposes, but because they possessed their own independent forms of knowledge and agency. Traditional ecological knowledge developed over thousands of years of close observation often tracked extremely subtle details. Migration timing, tied to specific plant blooms, predator-prey relationships, seasonal breeding cues. Researchers today increasingly recognize that this knowledge, passed down orally rather than written in scientific journals, frequently matches or even predates formal ecological findings by centuries. This represents a genuinely different model of understanding animals, one built on long-term relationship and coexistence, rather than classification and hierarchy. Ancient Chinese thought developed its own sophisticated animal framework, deeply tied to symbolism and cosmology. The 12-year cycle of the Chinese zodiac assigned specific personality traits to each animal, and while this wasn't biology in the modern sense, it reflected careful, accumulated cultural observation about animal temperament, the perceived cleverness of the rat, the steady strength of the ox, the unpredictable energy of the tiger. Chinese medicine also incorporated detailed animal-based observation into its practices, and traditional texts describe animal behavior tied to weather prediction, believing certain species could sense environmental shifts humans couldn't detect directly. Modern science has actually validated pieces of this. Some animals genuinely can detect subtle atmospheric pressure changes or seismic activity before humans notice anything at all. So where does this leave us? Ancient humans clearly understood a tremendous amount about animal behavior, tracking, domestication, seasonal patterns, and specific species temperament, often with an accuracy that required real, careful, repeated observation over generations. That's genuine understanding earned the hard way, through survival necessity. But when it came to the deeper question of what was actually happening inside an animal's mind, whether they felt, reasoned, or possessed something like a soul, ancient cultures almost universally reached for their own existing frameworks, gods, hierarchies, spirits, fate, to answer it. And that's arguably not so different from what we still do today. Modern science has only recently begun seriously entertaining evidence of complex animal cognition, emotional experience in mammals and birds, problem-solving in octopuses, grief-like behavior in elephants. For centuries, formal Western science actively resisted these ideas, insisting animals operated on instinct alone, an assumption not unlike Aristotle's ladder of nature dressed in newer language. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Maybe ancient humans weren't simply ignorant about animal minds. Maybe they were making the same kind of guess we're still making right now, just with a different vocabulary. And if that's true, the real question isn't whether ancient humans understood animals. It's whether we've actually finished understanding them ourselves, or whether we're still standing across from that same wolf, translating a mind we can observe closely but never fully enter.